Good morning. We're going to get started. There are some chairs in the very front. Side doors are available. Emergency exits on either side of the room. They may be behind you. So welcome to it's another installment of The Good, the Bad, and the Uncanny, exploring the Older Testament. We thought 3 books was too many last week, so we're doing 2 today. Joshua and Judges, which are challenging for reasons we'll talk about in just a moment. First, some announcements that are actually all really important today. So the first one is there's a video online on the adult ed web pages that Margaret and I conducted with Michael Chan, who's taught at Westminster before, on Joshua and Judges. Highly recommended. About a half hour long. Look for that. He will clear up any of the things that I don't clear up today, I'm sure. Also, we're not posting a new video this week. We are having a session in here next Sunday, but there's not a new video, and that's nothing's wrong with that. We just didn't plan one for that week. So if you go online Thursday or Friday saying, where's the new video, we're not having one next week. And also on Wednesday, in 3 days, on the 25th, we're not going to have a discussion session. That's only because the Wednesday night service is going to go long this week, and there's going to be a reception afterwards, and we didn't want to compete with Tim's farewell. So I'm sure there'll be questions or things you want to talk about regarding Joshua and Judges. We can get to those in 10 days instead of in 3 days, if that makes sense. All right? Told you they'd be important. Just some scheduling things to note. We're talking about Joshua and Judges, which means we're talking about land, and we're talking about possession of the land. We're going to talk about things like divinely sanctioned violence and warfare and a kind of colonialism, which are heavy topics in any setting. These are heavy topics for Americans, I think, in any date, any time. They're also, of course, really heavy topics as we think about what's going on right now in Israel and Gaza, the West Bank, even Lebanon. I just want to acknowledge that as one of the many things in the room today. The modern Zionist movement is a complicated thing, and I just want to note it goes way far beyond theology. It's not just a theological idea. And we should point out, too, that not all Jews have the same outlook on the modern state of Israel, or at least any kind of a theological basis for Israel's right to exist, let alone current politics and current politicians in the region. So in some ways, we're going to spend most of our time in ancient history today, but I want to acknowledge the reality of a very dicey situation right now, for which we continue to pray and worry and read. But hopefully that takes us as well to examine some of our own theological commitments about who has rights to what, and what does it mean to humanize one's neighbor, and how we deal with difference, and things like that. So if some of the things we're talking about today make you go, that sounds like what's happening in the world right now, you're correct. But what's happening in the world right now is also, I think, bigger and maybe more expansive than what we can get to certainly today. So just want to acknowledge that as we talk about this and worry about these passages. I want to start by reading a text from the book of Joshua, just a chapter from Joshua. If you're unfamiliar with the story of Joshua, this will help set the stage, I think, for what kind of a book this is and what kind of story it tells. I'm just going to read from Joshua 11. I didn't even put the text up because I just want you to listen to this maybe representative piece of the book. When King Jabin of Hatzor heard this, he sent to King Jobab of Madon, the king of Shimron, to the king of Afshaph, and to the kings who were in the northern hill country, and the Arabah south of Chinnereth, and in the lowland, and in Naphath Dor in the west, to the Canaanites in the east and the west, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, and the Jebusites in the hill country, and the Hivites under Hermon in the land of Mitzpah. They came out with all their troops, a great army, in number like the sand on the seashore, with very many horses and chariots. All these kings joined their forces and came and camped together at the waters of Merom to fight with Israel. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid of them, for tomorrow at this time I will hand over all of them, slain, to Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire." So Joshua came suddenly upon them with all his fighting force by the waters of Merom and fell upon them. And the Lord handed them over to Israel, who attacked them and chased them as far as Great Sidon and Mishrath-maim and eastward as far as the valley of Mitzpah. They struck them down until they had no one left remaining. And Joshua did to them as the Lord had commanded him. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots with fire. Joshua turned back at that time and took Hatzor and struck its king down with the sword. Before that time, Hatzor was head of all the kingdoms. And they put to the sword all who were in it, utterly destroying them. There was no one left who breathed. And he burned Hatzor with fire. And all the towns of those kings and all their kings Joshua took and struck them with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. But Israel burned none of those towns that stood on mounds, except Hatzor, which Joshua did burn. All the spoil of these towns and the livestock the Israelites plundered for themselves, but all the people they struck down with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them, and they did not leave any who breathed. As the Lord had commanded his servant Moses, so Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses. So Joshua took all that land, the hill country, and all the Negev, and all the land of Goshen, and the lowland, and the Arabah, and the hill country of Israel and its lowland. He took all their kings, struck them down, and put them to death. Joshua made war a long time with all those kings. There was not a town that made peace with the Israelites, except the Hivites, who all were taken in battle. For it was the Lord's doing to harden their hearts, so that they would come against Israel in battle, in order that they might be utterly destroyed and might receive no mercy, but be exterminated, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. At that time, Joshua came and wiped out the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their towns. None of the Anakim was left in the land of the Israelites. Some remained only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod. So Joshua took the whole land, according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses. And Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal allotments. And the land had rest from war. So that's representative of what we find in Joshua. That's only one of 3 campaigns that the book describes in detail. And so to get at this and to say, what is this doing in the Bible? What kind of story is this telling? What does this mean for us today? What I want to do today is cover 4 things. I want to talk about before and after this story. I want to situate it in the larger story that the Old Testament tells. I want to talk about the story itself. What's the story that Joshua tells? What's the story that Judges tells? They're not exactly the same story. Then I want to talk about the history. What do we know about what really happened during this time? And then I want to talk about the consequences, the so what question, right? What does it mean that we have these texts and these stories? So that's my way in to what's going to be kind of a heavy morning, at least a very heavy story as well. I should point out, too, if anybody wants to sit up in the front, there are some chairs up here. So the before and the after, like where are we in the Bible? What's going on? Perhaps you've been here in recent weeks. Perhaps you haven't. Let's get everybody caught up. I know that's tiny on the screen, but this is the table of contents in my Bible. And so we're at the 6th and the 7th books of our Older Testament, Joshua and Judges. You'll also notice that Ruth is there. We'll say more about Ruth in the weeks to come for sure. But what's going on at this time, these 2 books, Joshua and Judges, are set roughly around 1170, 1150, before the Common Era. And this is from our timeline, which is there in the back. If you haven't seen it, we've got this long timeline of the Older Testament writings. So it's the 12th century before the Common Era, when the so-called Holy Land was ruled by a variety of people, largely kings residing in urban areas. And you'll see the books written during this period not applicable. In other words, Joshua and Judges and Ruth, and then in 2 weeks, 1 Samuel, appear to have been written during the time of the Babylonian exile, which is about 600 years later. We've talked about that a little bit. I'll say more about that in just a moment. But just to note, these books were written roughly 600 years, or at least were finally written down in their current form about 600 years after the history they purport to tell. So that's what's going on with Joshua and Judges, and also Ruth, which interestingly enough is set in the time of the Judges, we're told in the opening verses. Just before this, the first 5 books we've already looked at, what Jews call Torah. which we often translate as law or means instruction. And so here we've got the old mythological stories about things like Noah's Ark and the Tower of Babel. We've got this family of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, their spouses, their children. We've got the Exodus from Egypt, the giving of the law, which was extensive. And then Deuteronomy ends with the death of Moses as they're looking at the land of promise that God has offered to them. Following Joshua, Judges, and Ruth, we're going to get a story of kingship and exile. 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings is all sequential, telling a story about the kings of Israel from Saul up until the end. And it's a period of many centuries, but it ends in devastation. It ends with the loss of the kingship, the loss of the temple, the loss of the kingdom. Just to set us in what's happening here, in Genesis 12, 1 through 9, first book of the Bible, only 12 chapters in, God calls Abram and his wife Sarai, and they come from what's modern-day Turkey. They journey into what's called then the land of Canaan, what we would refer to today as Israel, Palestine, the Holy Land, the Levant, Fertile Crescent, whatever you want to call it. And they go to a place called Shechem, where God reaffirms this promise, where God says in Shechem, to your offspring I will give this land. This is one of the big promises that hovers over the first 5 books as the nation is starting to come into being, even as it's a landless nation. When you get to the kingship story there in the red, that ends, 2 Kings 25, this is almost the very end of the book, where Jerusalem is overrun by the Babylonians. The ruling king, King Zedekiah, they bring his sons before him and they slaughter his sons, and then they gouge his eyes out, they take him in chains, and they march him off to Babylon. They destroy the temple, they tear down the walls of Jerusalem, its fortifications, and the Babylonian exile begins. The nation is essentially dead, defeated, and on its way into an exile that lasts several generations. That's where we're going. We'll get there right around Thanksgiving, so that'll also be kind of this well-timing with everything here, right? So that's where we're going. So remember, Joshua and Judges sits in the midst of this larger story that's being told here. Michael Chan in his video reminds us that there's land loss at the beginning of the story, the end of the story. Land loss happens in Genesis chapter 3 when Adam and Eve, the first humans, are tossed out of Eden. Remember that? And then as well, 2 Kings will end with land loss, with the Babylonians defeating the kingdom. And so it's a story that ends, at least, in military and cultural defeat and a reckoning. So part of what's going on in Joshua and Judges is a defeated people trying to make sense of who they are, how they got to where they are. Some other things that we might note about what's been going on in here and what we've in these books and what we've seen in the first 5 books in the Torah, Genesis through Deuteronomy. 2 things. One, we've seen a lot of focus on material living. In other words, the real stuff of life. In the Torah, in all of these laws that Margaret introduced us to last week, what we see is a vision for people, for real people, in terms of how do they live together. We see a vision for a nation. How is this nation going to function and not be like what life was like in Egypt? How is it going to be people who are just? The vision is one of a lived reality, of a society, of security, of economics, right? This isn't just ceremonial law. It's about imagining what material life is supposed to look like. The second thing we want to note in terms of what's already come before us in Torah is a sense of contingency, right? A sense of waiting. All 5 of those books, people are awaiting promises to be fulfilled, and one of the big pieces of those promises has to do with land. And so the story that's told in Torah, this vision for a distinctive nation, a distinctive people, is all set, right? It all takes place in this experience of waiting for promise, right? Waiting for a promise to be kept, waiting for land to be occupied, waiting for something to come into place. And again, this is all being written at the same time when, 600 years later, right, there's an exile, and people are asking questions about land and about nation and about sovereignty as well. So Joshua and Judges, they sit between 2 sections of a larger story. So we want to remember that, right? Looking backward, God is presented as a God who's powerful enough to establish a nation and to hold on to a nation and to protect a nation. It's this idealized theological promise that's going on throughout Torah. But then looking forward into the story that's told in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, we're going to see that's a story about actually occupying land, and land always seems to involve conflict, doesn't it, in one way, shape, or form. Somebody always wants your land. There's always pressure to protect your land, keep your land. And that certainly is true with these stories. So you have this idealized promise in Torah, and then what happens in the story of kingship to exile, we recognize that life is never as clean-cut or as simple as we might sometimes make it out to be. Right? The land will always be contested. Compromise and accommodation are always parts of what it means to be alive and occupying some place in this world. We might compare this, in some ways, Torah is like a really simplistic Sunday school class you might have gone to as a child, right? And been given this story that sounds perfect and simple. Then you have to go out and live Monday through Saturday, where all of a sudden morality is a lot more ambiguous and there's a lot more struggle in the world, right? Torah presents this idealized vision where we think, that would be great if everybody lived that way. That would be great if God was really among us in this way. That would be great if right and wrong were so clear and so simple and the poor were taken care of and nobody had any kind of stress in their lives, which in some ways is a priestly vision. When we get to kingship to exile, we're going to be reminded that life is a lot more difficult. So that's not to solve any questions about Joshua and Judges. It's just to say that we're now moving into this recognition as the story unfolds of just how difficult life can be living together and living with other people. I want to point out, too, we're going to have the story of Ruth, which we're not going to get back to until after the new year. But Ruth is this story. In the midst of these stories that are largely about what's mine is mine, you're going to have the story of Ruth that's largely about foreigners, quote-unquote foreigners, from the perspective of the land of Israel, who nevertheless treat each other incredibly well. And people who are supposed to be sworn enemies of one another, nevertheless creating family and creating kinship together. So the Bible often has these undercurrents that challenge the dominant story. Right now we're really sticking to the dominant story, but there's other stuff going on in the midst of the story as well. So how do we read Joshua and Judges? Michael Chan's going to tell us in his video to read them consecutively or in tandem, that they belong together. And that's certainly significant and worth doing. When it comes to Joshua, this is the mindset that I think governs the book of Joshua. We read about the violence in chapter 11 earlier. This is the very beginning. Moses has died. Joshua is his assistant. Joshua is now kind of stepping into the fore. And God says this to Joshua, "No one shall be able to stand against you all the days of your life." This is God again. "As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall lead the people to possess the land that I swore to their ancestors to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to act in accordance with all the law that my servant Moses commanded you. Don't turn from it to the right hand or to the left, so that you may be successful wherever you go. The book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth. You shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to act in accordance with all that is written in it. For then you shall make your way prosperous, and then you shall be successful." You see the idealized vision of law here, right? If you just do what I told you to do, everything's going to be just fine. Joshua, right? Easier said than done. And the confidence that's in here, right? Trusting God, God's going to deliver. There's a kind of theological sanction that's being spoken about here. As the story of Joshua gets rolling, basically we can divide the book into two parts. It's about the taking of land, and it's about the dividing of the land. I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but on the left, we've got a map. I love it says possible Exodus route. Underline possible there, right? This is the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, but it appears that the people make their way in Sinai for a while, eventually end up in modern-day Jordan, and then up at the top where you see Jericho, that's where they cross the Jordan River, and this is kind of where Joshua really kind of launches its military story. On the right, this is one of the maps that's online. This is one of the maps that Michael Gold put together for us. Eventually, the land will be divided. So Joshua 13 to 22 is probably the most boring section of the entire Bible, because it's nothing about saying, these tribes got this land. There's more to it than that. But for the most part, it's just simply naming places. It's an ancient geography lesson that we're not going to spend a lot of time with. But this is what happens by the end of the story, that the land is divided amongst the 12 tribes, and that story will continue in Samuel, 1 Samuel. To outline it, I'm going to go rather quickly through the story. We've moved from now before and after to what's the story. Joshua 1 through 12 is the story of the conquest, or the taking of the land. Joshua 13 to 22, the dividing of the land. And then there's two final speeches in Joshua 23 and 24. If you ever hear Joshua read in church, chances are you're hearing chapter 1, that be strong and courageous, I am with you. I think that was actually one of Tim's texts in the last month. You might hear the story of Rahab in chapter 2, this courageous woman who has more faith than the Hebrew spies. You might hear Joshua's final speech in chapter 24. You might even have this needlepoint and up on your wall, right? Choose this day whom you will serve, right? As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. That kind of language is there as well. Usually in church, we skip everything from chapter 3 to chapter 23. In general, you might have learned the story of Jericho when you were in Sunday school. I'm going to try to ruin that one for you today. Some of the highlights here, Rahab and the spies. Rahab is a Canaanite woman who lives literally in the wall of Jericho. The walls then were thick, and you could build apartments in them. She's described as a prostitute, and the two spies come and, quote, hide in her house. We're not sure why they chose her house, but she basically says to them, we know who you are, we know who your God is, we're all terrified, and she basically offers them haven and safe passage in exchange for preserving her life and her family's life. What's interesting about Rahab is she's named in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew's gospel. She becomes one of Jesus' ancestors. There's two chairs in the front if anybody wants to come around the side. There's 3 chairs in the front, actually. 4 chairs. We'll start auctioning them any moment now. The story of the crossing of the Jordan River. This is where they bring the Ark of the Covenant and the water is split open. It's this entry into the land that's quite dramatic. The story of Jericho, also quite dramatic. You might have learned this again in Sunday school, where they march around, blow the trumpet, and the walls fall, and they're able to rout the city of Jericho. It's the first big victory in Joshua. Those are some of the highlights, or maybe some of the stories you might have heard of before. The 2 final speeches of Joshua, he gives a speech in chapter 23 that sounds like it's his deathbed speech, but he's okay. He gives one more in chapter 24, where he goes to Shechem. I mentioned Shechem earlier, and remember what happened at Shechem? It's where Genesis 12, it's where Abram and Sarai go and where God reaffirms to them, this is the land I'll give to your descendants. So interesting that Shechem is chosen as the place for this grand final speech here, where Joshua essentially renews the covenant or leads the people in renewing the covenant. The language is, choose this day whom you will serve, right? Who are you really going to serve? And they all say, we're going to serve the Lord. And Joshua's like, nah, you can't serve the Lord. It's too hard. And they say, no, we're really going to serve the Lord. There's this interesting foreshadowing, right, of how what all this confidence might perhaps be more difficult to maintain. Joshua urges the people toward remaining faithful. And this in some ways sets up the story that's going to come, which is anything but a story of faithfulness. Which takes us to Judges then. Again, we're flying really high at 30,000 feet over the story of Judges as well. Judges begins with a prologue that describes all of these ongoing skirmishes. Having read Joshua, we would think all of the Canaanites have been utterly wiped out, at least most of them, because that's what it keeps describing. But in Judges, we keep hearing about all these places where Canaanites still exist and other people still exist. And sometimes they're beating the people of Israel, and sometimes there's still a sense of struggle. So we read Joshua 1 and 2, and we're a little bit confused, like what in the world's going on? We thought this battle had already been won. It's a different story. The Canaanites are still there. And then we get in 3 to 16 some lovely stories about individual judges. Now, these judges are essentially military leaders and rulers of various kinds. We might call them strongmen today, but they're not all men. We're going to meet one who's a woman as well. And they all have a kind of folktale-ish aspect to them. It doesn't necessarily mean they're happy stories, but they're all a little bit larger than life. You might have heard of Ehud. Just read this. If you're looking for something to do this afternoon, read Judges 3. If you're left-handed, you'll appreciate this story. This is why left-handed and underhanded have the meanings that they do, because a left-handed guy kills somebody. It's got all sorts of gross bathroom humor in it. It's great for Sunday school. Just read it. The story of Deborah, Barak, and Yael. This is a great story, too. Deborah is named as a prophet. she's named as a judge, and she's also a military commander. And one of the things that she does in her story is she exposes just how cowardly Barak is, right? She tells Barak basically, go into battle, you're going to do great. And Barak's like, I'm only going to go if you go with me. And then Deborah goes with him, and they win this battle. So the battle is told in chapter 4. Chapter 5, you have the Song of Deborah. You have the celebration of the battle. So if you wonder why there are so few strong women in the Bible, somebody will say, well, you got Judges 4 and 5. What more do you want, right? It's kind of that. But it's a lovely story. And then Yael is also just a great story. I'll talk about her in just a moment. The story of Gideon's trumpet, and the fleece. Gideon's one of these judges as well. Jephthah and his daughter. This is not a rollicking, fun story. This is a story about a man who sacrifices his daughter to fulfill the religious vow. By this point in Judges, we're getting a sense that the wheels are really starting to fall off in this culture, that people's ability to maintain a moral character and remain their faithfulness to God is tenuous at best. Then we get Samuel, which is kind of a comedy of a man who really can't control himself in any way, shape, or form. You probably remember the story of Samuel and Delilah. Samuel has multiple lovers. What's that? What did I say? Samuel. Oh, Samson. Sorry, it is Samson. I wish we had time just to make fun of Samson for an hour, because that's... and then it just gets worse. Judges 17 through 21, really utter deterioration in the society, terror. There's a story called The Levite's Concubine, which is one of the most violent, disturbing stories, really in all of Scripture, about sexual violence and dismemberment, and ends in civil war. Or as one commentator puts it, what happens in Judges 17 through 21 is we move from the victimization of one to the victimization of many. In other words, people are so unable to kind of maintain their own basic personal morality that the entire nation just deteriorates into chaos, which I don't think is overstating it. It's really a harsh story in that regard. So that's what's going on in Judges. Not a happy story, but again, there are some of these folk tales we can pull out. I mentioned the story of Yael and Deborah. This is they're kind of the original Thelma and Louise. To be honest, this is a grand story of Deborah, who, I don't know if I should even say this at Westminster. Can I say badass here? Deborah is kind of the original biblical badass woman, and Yael is a woman who appears to be part of the enemy, and there's an opposing general named Sisera, and Yael basically lures Sisera into her tent. It's not just about women with power. There's all sorts of questions about gender and sexualized power going on in parts of this book. And Yael kills Sisera by driving a tent peg through his temple. You'll never go camping again and look at your tent in the same way after reading this, but it's in a very violent book. You've got Yael, who's a hero for Israel, in a very hands-on kind of way. You've got Samson and Delilah, a story that's also been sensationalized and sexualized in a whole host of ways, but is a fascinating story about Samson's own strength, Samson's own devotion. Samson is this fearsome fighting machine, but who just seems to lack any kind of self-control, and just how dangerous that kind of strength and giftedness is in the hands of, or in the body of, right, a person who lacks that kind of self-control. So that's Judges. There's also some themes that run through Judges. I'm going to go quickly through the next two slides. Let me know if you see that theme starting to emerge. Then the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. These are Canaanite deities. The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, forgetting the Lord their God and serving the Baals and the Asherahs, other Canaanite deities. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. The Israelites again did what... You get the point, right? There's this refrain that shows up, which in some ways is funny, and there's some ways the commentary of what's going on with these people who have taken this land or been given this land in a theological sense, but don't seem to know how to handle it, and certainly can't live up to their law. There's another theme that emerges. Raise your hand when you see it. In those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. In those days, there was no king in Israel. And this then goes on to tell the story. The tribe of Dan is migrating, and there's a village of people in Laish, and they're described as these gentle, unassuming people, and the Danites just slaughter them. In those days when there was no king in Israel, a certain Levite, this introduces that story of the Levite's concubine, which is, again, maybe the worst story in all of Scripture. Judges 21:25, this is the final verse of the entire book. In those days there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. So when I talk about degradation, right, this is the story that Judges tells repeatedly. I mentioned at the very beginning that Judges describes a different kind of conquest. I'm not going to read this. I know the print's too small. This is a segment from the opening chapter of Judges, but if you just kind of let your eyes scan it, you might see things about, Judah could not drive out the inhabitants because they had chariots of iron. The Benjamins did not drive out the Jebusites. Manasseh did not drive out these inhabitants. The Canaanites continued to live in the land. Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites. The Canaanites lived among them in Gezer. And just so on. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants, whatever. There's this litany in the beginning of Judges about all of the indigenous people in Canaan who were not defeated or driven out. So you've got Joshua's story, which is largely a story of conquest, right? A story of this kind of lightning strike, these campaigns that just wipe out everybody. There's also, I could have given you a refrain from Joshua about basically don't leave anybody alive, and you might have heard that in Joshua 11. We get to Judges, and it sounds more like, my neighborhood, right? There's people who are different from me living all around me, and sometimes that's a problem, and sometimes that's just the way of life. It's much more a sense of just, this is who people are, and here they are in the land. So that takes us to the question of history. Like, what in the world is going on? I've gone through the story, right? What's the story that Joshua tells? What's the story that Judges tells? What's going on? Joshua describes a swift conquest, right? Literally an extermination. It looks like a genocide of people. Judges describes this more gradual settlement, assimilation, and these occasional conflicts that take place. What in the world is going on? Well, archaeology is helpful in this point because archaeology can look at some of these sites of these cities that supposedly were destroyed according to Joshua. Here's a portion of a reconstruction. This is not the original wall at Jericho. And archaeologists have been able to date the destruction of the wall that surrounded Jericho around 1550 BCE, which is nearly 400 years before Joshua takes place. In other words, as best we can tell from the archaeological evidence, most of these cities were already in ruins by the time Joshua and his people got there, which is interesting. In other words, the history appears to suggest, the material history, the physical history, the archaeological history, seems to suggest that there was no massive slaughter done by Joshua, and yet that's what the story has to say. So I want to show a short video now. Just somebody smarter than me can say it. I'm going to run a 2-minute video. This should all work just great because Keith knows what he's doing and I don't. And actually, can we slide that back, Brent, just so people can see she's going to mention 5 theories, which I'll kind of go back and walk through. This is an archaeology professor at Penn State named Ann Killebrew. And I can't make it larger. I don't know how.
The conquest story, as narrated in the book of Joshua, is one of our main sources for reconstructing how early Israel emerged in the land of Canaan, or in the land of Israel. There's 5 theories. One of them, the conquest theory, as described in the book of Joshua, describes a lightning campaign through the land of Israel, or the promised land, really wiping out, kind of committing almost genocide against the Canaanites. The second theory, as recounted in the book of Judges, is called the peaceful infiltration theory, which in many respects seems to contradict what's mentioned in the previous book, the book of Joshua. And then you have 3 other theories: the social revolutionary theory, which sees the early Israelites as essentially rebelling Canaanites, and the pastoral Canaanite theory, which sees the early Israelites as pastoral nomads, which settled down following the collapse of the late Bronze Age in the 12th and 11th centuries. And then you have my theory, the mixed multitude theory, which does encompass, I would say, bits and pieces of all of the above theories. Now, in the book of Joshua, There's certainly evidence which contradicts the archaeological record, most notably Jericho, which archaeologists have yet to find. Not only have they not found a wall, they haven't even found a settlement, which can be dated to the time that most scholars believe that Joshua would have led this campaign. In other accounts, we do have some aspects which does seem to be corroborated in the archaeological record, most specifically Mount Ebal and Hatzor.
So what's the significance then of all of this? Let me just get this restarted. Scholars are not sure what to make of the history. There's a variety of theories that try to get at the question, how did this people known as Israel emerge as people who possessed this particular land? So the 5 theories I put there on the board, just in case, I know that went by quickly. Conquest and extermination, essentially, what Joshua says is correct, that there was essentially a genocide that took place where people were utterly wiped out. That theory is really not supported by most of the archaeological record. The peaceful infiltration theory, more like Judges, that you had people who kind of gradually just came to live as strangers into this land. The social revolutionary theory is that there was some kind of an uprising that took place against oppressive rulers. There are some scholars who think that even that word Canaanites is not an ethnic term, but Canaanites refers to the urban elites who dwelled in cities, who were oppressing the peasants who lived in the land, and so that what Israel is more the kind of the outcome of this uprising among the peasant class that took over cities. The 4th one is essentially a belief that these nomadic groups settled in and kind of found their place in a culture, in a land whose cities and whose kind of economic infrastructure had already collapsed and took place. And then the mixed multitude is essentially, maybe all of this is true in one way, shape, or form, right? Maybe in some places there was outright violence, maybe even religiously sanctioned violence. Maybe there were also other kinds of social unrest taking place. Maybe there was no strong sense of Canaanite identity. Most scholars are pretty convinced that whoever Israel was, whoever we understand the ancient Israelites to be, they probably were some kind of a subset of what the Bible calls Canaanites. So that's my best Venn diagram there on the board. That Canaanites is this catch-all term to describe a variety of different groups, we might even call them tribes, who occupied the land, and the people who came to be known as Israel were probably some kind of a subset of them, maybe some others who came from kind of outside of that ring. Part of this appears to as well, I think it's pretty clear, there seems to be a rural-urban divide taking place here. And that's not just where people live, that has to do with class and wealth as well. Michael Chan in the video will talk about the importance of walls, like why he refers to Joshua as being obsessed with walls and the city walls of Jericho. When we get to the story of Solomon in the book of 1 Kings, Solomon as well will be obsessed with building walls. Walls are one of the ways in which kings show their power, fortify their population centers, and also use enslaved labor to do it. So what's going on here in this talk about walls? I think it's pretty clear that there probably was no all-out genocide the way that Joshua describes in terms of what happened. But the question then is, well, why does the story remain? If there was no historical genocide, you still have a story that holds up genocide and even maybe celebrates genocide as something that God sanctions. Which leads me then to really the most important part of all this, and one of the reasons I've gone so quickly up to this point is just ask the question of the consequences. Right? What are the consequences of a story like Joshua's in our scripture? I think we can say this. I think this is a pretty conservative or pretty safe conclusion that the conquest story that Joshua describes appears to be more interested in teaching values than in reciting history. In other words, the archaeological record doesn't fully line up, but what are the values this book is trying to put forward? Why is this story of conquest and extermination remembered as it's remembered? Why is it described as God's will? What are the values that the book's trying to pass on? And you'll see a lot of question marks on this slide because nobody's quite sure. But here are 6 possibilities. Right? Is the book trying to give a confident declaration of the power of God? Again, written to a people who have just suffered a humiliating cultural and military defeat. Is this a way of looking back to the founding of the nation and trying to rebuild trust in God, or a God who always is on, quote unquote, our side? Is the value a kind of criticism of oppressive rule or of kingship in general? Is the story meant to provide a cautionary distinction between the God of Israel and the Canaanite deities? When we get to 1st and 2nd Samuel, especially in 1st and 2nd Kings, we're going to keep asking the question, what makes for a good king? What makes for a bad king? And a lot of time it's going to come down to what other religions are people practicing. One of the main stresses in the story of Israel and then later Judah is, are they able to remain faithful to the God of Israel, the lone one God of Israel, or not? Usually it's not. Is the value that the book's trying to advance, is it a deliberate distortion of history? Is there a kind of propaganda that's going on here? Is it a deliberate attempt to demonize so-called outsiders, to make the Canaanites less than fully human and deserving of extinction? Is it a way of shoring up religious legitimation of violence? Like, these are some of the possibilities, some more positive in some ways, others more negative in other ways. It's easy to look back on this story because it's a historical story and it's not necessarily my story, and try to imagine it's an academic exercise or it matters for somebody else. But this is a story that I think matters deeply for us today in 21st century America. And for this, I want to go to a scholar. This is Robert Allen Warrior, is a member of the Osage Nation and a literature professor. And he has a short little essay called Canaanites, Cowboys, and Indians that reflects on the story of Joshua in ways I think are really helpful. And what he basically says is that, the Exodus story, the story of God redeeming a people from enslavement and giving them a place to live and dignifying them with nationhood, he said that's a great story for a lot of oppressed people around the world. But he says it doesn't work for Native Americans for obvious reasons, right, who so much look like the Canaanites, or at least it's easy to map the story. So he offers 3 bits of advice to American Christians working with this story or wondering, what do we do with this story in our scriptures? And point 1, this might seem obvious, but it's important. How do we keep the Canaanites at the center of our moral reflection and advocacy? In other words, how do we avoid dehumanizing the Canaanites, but ask questions about who are they, what really happens to them or happens to them in the story? Why would we say they, quote unquote, matter? Second, how do we explore how Joshua's conquest story has influenced American consciousness and ideology? This idea of America as a new promised land, which was so there in a lot of the Puritan literature, a lot of the original, to what I want, kind of immigration from the United Kingdom to America, right? How has this infiltrated our own consciousness, this idea of a land that, quote unquote, belongs to us, whoever us is, different ways of parsing that, but in a way that also then dehumanizes Native peoples. The third point he makes, I find especially interesting, is to consider what's lost if Joshua's conquest story is actually erasing a history of indigenous struggle. This gets closer to like number 3 and number 4. Like, what if the actual emergence of Israel came out of a history in which indigenous people rose up against oppression and then found a way to live together, to hold on to a land for a time, to imagine a way of being together in the land, to worship together in the land, to have shared economy, to have shared defense in this land, right? What if the story behind the emergence of Israel is a story of indigenous peoples fighting for justice? And he says, if Joshua is actually erasing that in favor of a story about conquest, he says, and there's no place for indigenous Americans to find their home in the Christian story, so to speak, right? You make sense the trying to say there, right? He's right. What if the story for an indigenous American Christian isn't assimilate into a conqueror's religion, but is actually to find kinship there in the struggle for justice? See what I mean? I find that a really interesting point, right, where he's getting at the history and getting at some of these theories. This is a ton of material to go through, and I made a conscious choice to kind of, just open the fire hydrant and just spray you all down for 45 minutes until you couldn't take anymore and take in a lot. But I did that because I wanted to spend some time with a question to talk about at our tables. And this, I'm taking a step back away now from Joshua and Judges in the particular and looking more abstractly. But it's about it's about the power of story. It's about the power of a story about conquest. It's about the power of stories that we turn to when we experience humiliation or defeat, and to help us answer the question of who we are. So this is what I want you to think about. Groups often face a reckoning when their reality doesn't live up to their ideals. That shouldn't be ideals and values. This can happen for nations, this can happen for families, can happen for churches, can happen for businesses, right? What happens when you finally decide, like, we've totally run off the rails or something horrible has happened? In a way, America faced a reckoning on 9/11. Didn't we, trying to figure out what happened here? What does this say about who we are? How do we move forward? So my question to discuss is this. What stories matter when there's a reckoning in a family, in a business, in a community, in a nation, in a church? Right? What stories do we tell when we feel we have to correct ourselves, right, to do better going forward, or to empower us to survive one more day? Or sometimes we tell stories to hide our shortcomings, right? Sometimes we lie to ourselves, or we find other stories that help us kind of gloss over the places in our own history where we've fallen short. Does that question make sense? It's an abstract question. Maybe you have some specifics you want to tell as you imagine your own nation, family, church, business, whatever kind of community you're thinking of. But I want to get at the power of Joshua's story for ancient people, but also then for us, right? How is this a story that we use to either to lie to ourselves or to disillusion ourselves, or how is it a story we use to rebuild ourselves? Or what? What do we do with a story like this? And what do we do with other stories that are similar? That'll be a really easy question for you all to figure out in about 10 minutes at your tables. I'm not looking for there's no brilliant answer I've got in my head. I just want you to kind of reflect on what you've heard and how this matters for the power of these foundational stories for some, and the power they have to do real harm to others. All right, first table to finish gets something. Margaret's got a gift. And folks online can use the chat if you want.